Hello everyone and welcome to another video. At the time I'm recording this, the weather has taken a seriously rainy turn here in the UK, but I wanted to bring a bit of sunshine and fun with these Pina Colada paintings. If you just want to watch, then sit back and enjoy, but if you'd like to paint along, then here are the tools that I'm using today. For paints, I'm using my Winsor & Newton Cotman 45 half pan watercolour set. That was a mouthful, wow. I always use a collection of synthetic brushes. To outline, I'll use my Pigma Micron fine liners. I've got my Posca white paint pen. I also reached for my Watercolour's metallic watercolour set. And finally, of course, I've got the paintings that I'm going to be painting today. Before we can get painting, we have to mix our colours. I'm starting with a yellow shade, so I'm mixing cadmium yellow pale, lemon yellow and some water to make this lovely golden yellow shade, which I'll be using as a base for pretty much every one of the 4 paintings that I'm doing today. I then created another yellow shade, this time using cadmium yellow pale and raw sienna to mix a lighter yellow colour. And the final yellow shade is a bit darker, this time made using raw sienna, gamboge and lemon yellow. I then mixed a green shade out of raw sienna and sap green. And I made a red shade using cadmium red deep and alizarin crimson. After that I mixed a deep green shade using Viridian, Hooker's green light and sap green together. And finally I made myself a brown shade with raw umber and burnt umber, and when I was done mixing that, it was time to start painting. So I'm going to begin with showing you the Pina Colada cocktail itself, and the first step was to paint the cherry using the red shade I'd already mixed. When I'd finished with the cherry, I moved on to paint alternating stripes on the straw of the drink red. I imagined this straw as a paper straw, just in case you were worried about like painted plastic. It's paper. To paint the drink inside the glass, I did a wash of just water, and then I added my 3 yellow shades in a gradient from top to bottom. So from the bottom I started with the lightest shade, and then I added the middle shade on top of that, and I finished with the darker shade on top of that. I didn't think the contrast was really strong enough, so I decided to use paint that was straight from the water palette instead of the ones that I'd mixed. So I went over the paint that I'd already applied, using cadmium yellow pale over the lightest shade, gamboge over the medium shade and cadmium yellow over the darkest shade, and it looked a lot better. When I'd finished with that, I added some Chinese white straight from the palette again to the top of the drink. Because I'd applied water followed by wet mixed paint followed by wet pure paint, there was a heck of a lot of water on the page and it was creating some pools of paint that I didn't really want. So I just used a piece of paper towel to soak up some of that excess water. After that, I used a flat brush and I dragged it horizontally across the drink to even out the shades and blend the gradient that I'd created. The next step, once all that had more or less dried, was to paint the pineapple slice on the rim of the glass. To start with the rind, I did a line of water where the rind met the flesh, and then dropped some of the light green shade that I'd mixed into that water. Then when that had dried, I did another line just above that one with the darker green. And the rind was completed once that second green line had dried, so I could paint the spiky bits of the pineapple skin just above it with the brown shade that I mixed earlier. For the flesh of the pineapple, I started by painting the whole thing with water, and then I just dropped in the 3 shades of yellow that I mixed earlier in a random spacing and let them bloom and mix together naturally. When everything had completely dried, I used the shade Moon Gold from this Watercolour's metallic watercolour set to do the lines on the straw that I hadn't painted red. While that gold was drying, it was time to do some detailing, and for that I reached for my Posca paint pen. I first added a light catch onto the cherry to make it look nice and shiny and juicy, and following that I added little lines going from the centre of the pineapple slice towards the rind. After that I used my Pigma Micron fine liner in the size 05 to outline the glass, the cherry, the straw and the outside of the pineapple slice. Then I switched to the size 02 of the Pigma Micron fine liners to outline the rind and the skin of the pineapple slice and the stripes of the straw. But now that I've finished up with the outlining, here is the finished painting. The next painting I'm going to work on is this flower, and I'm starting by painting the whole thing with just water, and then I'm dropping in some Chinese white and spreading it over the petals. I then let that dry for a little bit, but before it was completely dry I used the lighter yellow shade I mixed before to add some colour to the centre of the flower and the tips of the petals. For the centre, I applied the yellow to where the petals met in the middle, and then I took the colour like up the centre of each petal as well. When I'd done that with the lightest yellow, I went over it with the medium yellow shade just to add an extra tone to the flower. I then waited for all of the paint to dry completely before outlining the flower with a fine liner in the size 05. So this painting was super quick and super easy, but because of that it was a joy to paint. But now that I've finished with it, here is a look at it all complete. So the next thing that I'm going to paint in this video is this little cocktail umbrella, and the first step to paint it is to paint alternating sections of it yellow. The reason I'm doing alternating sections is because I want them to be distinct from each other, and if I paint them all at once they'll just bleed into one another and they won't be as individual. Once the first sections had dried, I went back in and I did the other sections in the same way. Oh, I forgot to mention that when I was done painting them just a base shade of yellow, I also dropped in some bits of the darker shade to add a bit more interest. I then left that to one side to dry again, and once all of the yellow had completely dried, I painted the little flower designs with my red shade. Because red is a darker colour than yellow, I didn't have to like carefully go around the flowers when I was painting the yellow, because I knew that the red would just show up regardless. So I'm literally just adding dots of red over the top of the yellow background that I'd already painted, and it's fine. For once, I didn't have to wait for the layer that I just painted to dry, because the red isn't going to touch any bits of the wood that I'm about to paint, so I can just immediately move on to using the brown shade I mixed earlier to paint the cocktail stick and the ferrules of the umbrella. Yes, I did look up what the little sticks that hold an umbrella together are called. Now to add a nice little bit of shine, I used the moon gold shade from my metallic watercolour set to paint the centres of the flowers when the petals had dried. I outlined most of the umbrella with my fine liner in the size 05, but for the smaller details I swapped to the size 02 to have a bit more control. And then when I was done outlining, I was done with the painting. So here's a look at the finished cocktail umbrella painting. The final painting that I'm working on today is of a pineapple. So to start the painting off, I was painting a layer of water on the page and then dropping in the medium yellow shade and letting it spread. Then when the whole thing was yellow but the paint was still wet, I dropped in the light green shade behind where the spikes are going to go, and I let that spread out a little bit as well. But I was using smaller amounts to make sure it didn't just completely obscure and take over the yellow that I'd already painted. I let that dry a little bit so the paint was still wet, but not so wet that any paint I added on top would go absolutely everywhere. And then I added spots of the darker green on top of the lighter green I'd already applied. I then thought, oh, I've added a bit too much green there, so I used the darker yellow shade to fill in the spaces around the green and add some more yellow back into the painting. I let that dry completely so that when I started painting the leaves they didn't bleed into the skin of the pineapple, and then I started painting evenly spaced leaves that weren't touching with the palest green. I let those light green leaves dry, and then I painted some more evenly spaced leaves with the darker green I'd mixed before. I was trying to space out the shades of green so that there was a nice even variety of green shades within the leaves. While those dark green leaves were drying, I used the brown shade I mixed before to paint the spikes on the skin of the pineapple. Again, this is a darker shade than the one below it, so I was able just to paint over what I'd already painted because it was going to show up over the yellow and green. I didn't need to worry about painting around the spikes with the yellow and green beforehand. For the next shade of green in the leaves, I mixed the two green shades together with a lot of water so that it was a nice midpoint of the two greens, but it also had that translucent quality that watercolours can provide. And finally, once that layer of green leaves was dry, I mixed the shades Hooker's Green Light and Hooker's Green Dark together in the palette and painted the leaves with water, and then I just added that final green shade into the water on the page. I used the 02 sized fine liner to outline the brown spikes on the skin, and then I swapped to the 05 fine liner to outline the rest. I really enjoy pina coladas, but I try not to consume too much alcohol, so I have them very infrequently. I think because they're made with coconut rum, it's really hard to make it without alcohol because it's basically just pineapple juice. But if anyone knows of a great virgin pina colada recipe, let me know. Maybe you can use like coconut flavoured syrup or coconut water or something, but I really love them. So yeah, let me know if there is a good recipe without any alcohol. When I finished outlining, I used my white Posca paint pen to add some spikes at the top of the leaves because pineapples are highly dangerous and pointy fruits. But with that, I was done working on it, so here is the finished painting. And there we have 4 pina colada inspired watercolour paintings. These paintings are available as a printable file to purchase on my Etsy shop, which is linked in the description, but if you do decide to paint your own versions, please tag me in your pictures on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is @WhatsIt'sHannah on everything, and my social medias are all linked below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to see more content like this. Other than that, have a lovely day and goodbye!